This is the most beautiful acoustic guitar you have ever seen. A Gibson Custom Shop SJ200.
Rare musical instruments rarely appear in pawn shops, but when they do, they often carry layers of history far beyond their condition or price tag. During one episode of Pawn Stars, an unassuming acoustic guitar immediately stood out to Rick Harrison for reasons that went far beyond its appearance. The instrument was identified as a 1941 Gibson SJ200, a model produced in extremely limited numbers before major wartime changes reshaped American manufacturing. Its age, construction, and originality placed it among the most significant guitars ever evaluated inside the shop, raising questions of authenticity, value, and long-term collectibility and historical importance. The Gibson SJ200 occupies a distinct position in the company's acoustic guitar lineup. Introduced in the late 1930s, it was designed as Gibson's most ambitious flat-top instrument, intended to surpass existing models in both size and presence. The SJ200 featured what became known as the Super Jumbo body, making it one of the largest production acoustic guitars of its time. This design was not simply cosmetic. It was built to project more volume and fuller tonal range, catering to professional musicians who needed power and clarity in live settings. From its introduction, the SJ200 was marketed as a premium instrument. It sat at the top of Gibson's pricing structure and was produced in far smaller numbers than more accessible models. Early examples were often custom-ordered and built with higher-grade materials, reinforcing their status as flagship instruments rather than mass-market products. By the early 1940s, the SJ200 had already earned a reputation for prestige, but production remained limited. The onset of wartime conditions further constrained output, making guitars from this period especially scarce. As a result, early SJ200s are viewed not only as musical instruments, but as artifacts from a brief and highly specific chapter in Gibson's manufacturing history. The year 1941 represents a critical boundary in Gibson's production history. Instruments built during this period were produced as the company was already facing material uncertainty and operational changes tied to the expanding global conflict. Although the United States had not yet fully entered wartime production, manufacturers were beginning to experience limitations that would soon reshape how instruments were built. For Gibson, this meant that guitars produced around 1941 often reflect a mix of pre-war craftsmanship and early transitional adjustments. Certain materials that had been standard in the late 1930s were becoming harder to source, and production efficiency was increasingly prioritized. These conditions resulted in lower output and greater variability between individual instruments. As a result, guitars from this period are neither fully pre-war nor clearly post-war in character. Instead, they occupy a narrow window where traditional construction methods were still in use, but consistency across production runs was declining. This makes surviving examples particularly difficult to authenticate and compare. From a collector's perspective, 1941 instruments carry added importance because they represent the final phase of Gibson's uninterrupted pre-war manufacturing approach. Once wartime restrictions fully took hold, both materials and labor availability changed significantly. Instruments produced just before that shift are therefore viewed as the last examples of an earlier standard, increasing their historical and financial significance. The physical construction of an early Gibson SJ200 plays a central role in determining both its authenticity and value. The most immediately recognizable element is the Super Jumbo body, which was significantly larger than standard acoustic guitars of the era. This oversized design was intended to increase volume and projection, setting the model apart within Gibson's lineup. Early 1940s SJ200 guitars are typically associated with a sunburst finish and a carved spruce top, paired with rosewood back and sides. This combination contributed to both the instrument's tonal depth and its visual presence. Later production years would introduce changes in materials, making rosewood-backed examples from this period especially notable. Additional identifying features include the mustache-style bridge, which was both functional and decorative, and an ornate pickguard that reflected Gibson's emphasis on craftsmanship for its flagship instruments. Neck construction, binding details, and fingerboard material are also closely examined when dating guitars from this era, as small variations can indicate specific production periods. Because Gibson's documentation from the early 1940s is incomplete, these physical characteristics often carry more weight than serial numbers alone. Collectors and appraisers rely on the cumulative consistency of these details to determine whether a guitar genuinely aligns with early SJ200 production standards, particularly when assessing instruments attributed to 1941. Authenticating a Gibson SJ200 from the early 1940s presents a unique set of challenges, particularly for instruments dated to 1941. During this period, Gibson's record-keeping was inconsistent, and serial numbers were not applied with the precision seen in later decades. As a result, serial numbers alone are often insufficient for establishing an exact production year. Instead, verification relies on a detailed examination of construction features and manufacturing details. Factory order numbers, when present, provide some guidance, but these markings were not always applied uniformly. Appraisers, therefore, assess a combination of elements, including body dimensions, wood selection, binding patterns, neck profile, and hardware style. Each of these details helps narrow the instrument's placement within Gibson's production timeline. Condition also plays a significant role in authentication. Repairs, replaced parts, or refinishing can obscure original features, complicating the evaluation process. Even period-correct replacements can reduce certainty when determining originality, which is critical for high-value instruments. Because of these factors, credible authentication typically requires input from experienced vintage guitar specialists rather than general appraisers. For a model as rare and valuable as a pre-war SJ200, professional verification is essential. Without it, establishing authenticity and market value becomes increasingly difficult, particularly for guitars attributed to specific transitional years like 1941. The market value of a pre-war Gibson SJ200 is shaped by a combination of rarity, condition, and verified originality. Because production numbers were low and survival rates are limited, early examples are seldom offered for sale. When they do appear, they are typically handled through specialized vintage dealers or private transactions rather than general retail markets. Condition plays a decisive role in valuation. Instruments that retain original finishes, hardware, and structural integrity command significantly higher prices than those with extensive repairs or replaced components. Even necessary maintenance, such as neck resets or crack repairs, can influence value depending on the quality and documentation of the work. Originality is equally important. Collectors closely examine whether key elements, including the bridge, tuners, pickguard, and internal bracing, remain factory original. Any deviations, even if period correct, can reduce market confidence and limit the pool of potential buyers. Beyond physical factors, demand is driven by the SJ200 status within Gibson's history. As the company's flagship acoustic model, early examples carry prestige that extends beyond sound or playability. They are often viewed as long-term collector assets rather than performance instruments. For this reason, pricing can vary widely, but authenticated pre-war SJ200 guitars are consistently regarded as high-value pieces. Their appeal lies not only in scarcity, but in their representation of a brief and influential era of American instrument manufacturing. When the 1941 Gibson SJ200 was presented for evaluation, Rick Harrison approached it with a level of caution reserved for exceptionally rare items. As a longtime dealer, he was immediately aware that instruments of this caliber fall outside the scope of typical pawn transactions. Their value is tied not only to market demand, but to authentication, preservation, and long-term resale considerations. Rick's assessment focused on risk as much as potential return. High-value vintage guitars require specialized buyers, extended holding periods, and in many cases, third-party verification before any sale can be completed. Unlike more liquid collectibles, instruments at this level cannot be easily converted into cash without careful positioning in the collector market. He also considered the challenges associated with originality and condition. Any uncertainty surrounding repairs, replaced components, or undocumented history can significantly affect value. For a guitar from the early 1940s, even small ambiguities can translate into substantial financial exposure. From a business standpoint, the SJ200 represented a museum-grade artifact rather than a conventional retail opportunity. Rick recognized its historical importance, but also understood that acquiring such an instrument would require confidence not only in its authenticity, but in the limited number of buyers capable of purchasing it at its true market level.